In the brutal, high-country winter of 1883, the camp known as Centennial City was a monument to failure. Two structures told the entire story. The first was Hiram Culpepper's new company bunkhouse, a proud two-story log building 30 feet long, built with Eastern money and Eastern pride. From its chimney, a thick black column of smoke poured into the frigid air, a desperate, constant feeding of a fire that did nothing. Inside, 6 men huddled in their coats, their breath fogging, the water in their buckets frozen solid. They were burning nearly a cord of pine every 2 days, and the temperature 6 feet from the roaring fireplace was 29 degrees Fahrenheit. Just half a mile away, nestled into the south-facing slope of the valley, was the second structure. It was, by all accounts, a hovel, a mound of earth barely 12 feet across, with a single low door and a stovepipe no thicker than a man's arm, releasing a wisp of smoke so thin it was almost invisible. This was the home of Silas Vane, the mountain man the settlers had mocked. Inside, Vane sat on his cot in a wool shirt, mending a snowshoe. The air was warm, 68 degrees Fahrenheit. He had used, perhaps, 6 logs all day. While Culpepper's men were freezing to death in a $150 structure, Silas Vane was comfortable, surviving on a fraction of the resources. The settlers, facing the oncoming blizzard, looked at their massive, failing cabins and Vane's tiny pit house with contemptuous pity. What did this solitary mountain man, this relic of the trapping era, understand about the physics of survival that the educated, ambitious engineers of the New West had completely missed? The year was 1883, and the Colorado Rockies were in the grip of a silver boom. Men flooded into the high valleys, chasing rumors of ore veins that could make a man a king. They brought with them their families, their tools, and most dangerously, their assumptions. Centennial City, established at 9,500 feet, was a raw, unformed settlement. The new arrivals, mostly from Ohio, Illinois, and New York, were driven by the manuals and pamphlets distributed by the railroad and mining companies. Conventional wisdom, backed by centuries of European and Eastern American tradition, demanded a proper house, the American log cabin. This was the icon of the frontier. The manuals were specific. Logs should be no less than 12 inches in diameter, saddle-notched at the corners, with a high-pitched roof to shed the snow. A large stone fireplace was essential, not just for heat, but as the moral center of the home. This was the right way. It was a symbol of taming the wilderness, of imposing order and civilization upon a savage land. Bigger was better. Thicker walls meant more strength. A roaring fire meant warmth and prosperity. This was the doctrine. Hiram Culpepper, the foreman for the Centennial Mining and Investment Company, was the doctrine's chief apostle. He was building his bunkhouse by the book, and he looked with open disdain upon Silas Vane, a man who had been in the valley for 20 years, living, in Culpepper's words, no better than a prairie dog in a hole. Hiram Culpepper's bunkhouse was, on paper, a fortress. It measured 30 feet by 24 feet, with a high-pitched roof and a massive fieldstone chimney that took 4 men a full week to build. The walls were thick spruce logs, 14 inches in diameter, felled and hauled to the site at great expense. The cost in materials alone for milled floorboards, glass windows from Denver, and iron hardware exceeded $150, a small fortune. It took a crew of 8 men working from dawn until dusk, 3 full weeks to complete. It was a statement. But by the first week of November, the statement it made was one of lethal arrogance. The logs, cut green in the summer rush, had begun to dry in the freezing, arid air. They shrank, the mud and grass chinking. Applied in warmer weather, froze, cracked, and fell out, opening gaps between the logs that you could slide a hand through. The grand fireplace, the structure's heart, became its greatest vulnerability. It was a glutton, consuming wood at a shocking rate, yet 90% of its heat went straight up the chimney, Worse, it acted as a giant bellows, sucking frigid. And then the gris fair in, through every one of the new gaps in the walls. The lung fever began in the second week of November. Dr. Arbuthnot, the company physician, noted that the men sleeping in the bunks furthest from the fire had their blankets freeze solid to the interior walls, which were coated in a thick, glittering layer of rime ice. The bunkhouse was not a shelter. It was a cold storage warehouse, slowly killing its occupants, all while consuming a forest of fuel. Silas Vane was a man out of time. He was not a settler, he was a survivor. His father had been a French-Canadian voyageur with the Hudson's Bay Company, and his youth was spent not in classrooms, but in the extreme cold of the Canadian North. He had trapped with the Cree, who taught him the principle of the Carmack, a semi-subterranean dwelling that used the Earth's stable temperature and a snowpack's insulation. He had wintered with the Ute in these very mountains, observing how they sighted their wickiups out of the wind, not against it. He had learned from the beaver, whose lodge was a masterpiece of thermal efficiency, with an underwater entrance and a central living chamber insulated by mud and sticks. Vane had no formal education in engineering, but he possessed a doctorate in applied thermodynamics earned through 20 winters of survival. He understood what the settlers did not, that the enemy was not the cold, but heat loss. He knew that a 12-inch log was a terrible insulator. It was a thermal bridge, a highway for heat to escape. When the settlers arrived and began their grand construction, they mocked him. "Why are you digging a grave, Vane?" Culpeper had asked, seeing the small pit Vane was excavating in the hillside. Vane just looked up, smiled and said, "A grave is cold. This is warm." The settlers mistook his efficiency for poverty, his wisdom for laziness. Vane began his construction in late August. His first and most important decision was siting. He chose a south-facing slope which would receive maximum sun, and he began to dig. He excavated a 10-foot by 12-foot pit, 4 feet deep. This pit, as the settlers called it, was his first line of defense. The ground, 4 feet down, remains at a stable 45–50 degrees C, even when the air temperature is 40 degrees. His house wouldn't be fighting 40 degrees Celsius. It would be starting at 50 degrees. The 4-foot earthen walls of the pit were lined with dry stacked stone he gathered from the slope. This stone was not structural, it was thermal mass. Above this 4-foot base, he framed a double wall using cheap, thin scrap lumber and discarded canvas. The two walls were 18 inches apart. The settlers laughed at this. "A canvas wall, Vane? The wind will shred it." But Vane wasn't building for strength. He was building for insulation. He spent 2 weeks meticulously harvesting dry grasses, moss and pine needles, and densely packed the 18-inch gap. He created an 18-inch thick, bone-dry blanket of trapped air, an insulation value the settlers' 12-inch green logs couldn't match. The roof was low, only 7 feet at its peak, and was also a double layer, designed to be covered with 3 feet of the excavated sod and earth. It was a living roof, a thermal cap. When he was finished, his cabin looked like a burial mound with a small door. It cost him 8 zeros, the price of the small, airtight cast-iron stove he'd had hauled in. The conflict was one of philosophy. The settlers, led by Culpeper, believed in brute force. Theirs was a battle of conquest. They would defeat the cold by building bigger structures and burning bigger fires. A 12-inch log was 12 inches of protection. A massive fireplace was a sign of a man's dominion. They were trying to create heat in a world that was a vacuum for it. Silas Vane's philosophy was one of efficiency. His was a battle of conservation. He knew he could not defeat the cold. He could only outsmart it. He wasn't trying to create heat. He was trying to keep the little heat he made. He understood the physics that Culpeper ignored. Conduction. His 4-foot-deep pit walls didn't lose heat to the frozen air. They gained heat from the stable, 50-degree earth. Convection. His tiny 840 cubic foot interior was a fraction of Culpeper's 760 cubic foot air volume. His airtight stove heated the air in the room, which then heated the stone thermal mass of his walls, creating a heat battery. Culpeper's fireplace heated nothing but the chimney and the air directly in front of it. Radiation. Vane's 18-inch grass wall had a modern equivalent R value of nearly R30. Culpeper's 12-inch green log, with its high moisture content, had an R value of R8. And that was before the wind started blowing through the gaps. The settlers were in a fight with the mountain. Vane had simply asked the mountain to shelter him. Dr. Arbuthnot, the physician, was a man of science. He was methodical, curious, and increasingly horrified by the conditions in the main camp. He had begun recording interior temperatures and fuel consumption in a small ledger. In mid-November, on a mild day of 10 degrees, he made his rounds. His notes on Culpeper's bunkhouse read, "Interior, 8 a.m., 35 degrees, base 1, 6 degrees, severe drafts from all walls, humidity from respiration freezing on bedding, fuel, 1/4 cord, estacas, in 24 hours, 2 new cases of lung fever." That afternoon, out of a morbid curiosity, he visited Vane. He had to bend low to enter the dark. 4-foot-long tunnel that led to Vane's door. He stepped inside and was shocked. The air was not just warm, it was comfortable. Vane was in his shirt sleeves. A small kettle simmered on the stove. Arbuthnot pulled out his certified mercury thermometer. After 10 minutes, he recorded it in his ledger, underlining the entry. Interior, 68 degrees, 20 degrees. No observable drafts. Air is dry. Stove is banked low. Consuming 1 small log per hour, Vane reports he has used 1/8 of a cord in 3 weeks. It is remarkable. Culpeper saw the report and scoffed. A 10 by 12-foot coffin. Of course it's warm. It's not fit for working men. It's fit for a hermit. Vane's tiny cabin was not a simple structure. It was a precisely engineered system. Let us break down the 5 layers of defense that the settlers had missed. The first layer was the earth itself. By sinking the structure 4 feet into the ground, Vane eliminated 90% of the surface area exposed to the deadly wind. The wind simply blew over his house. This 4-foot pit also acted as a geothermal battery, using the 50-degree of ground to stabilize his interior temperature. The second layer was the thermal mass. The dry stacked stone walls lining the pit were his heat sink. During the day, the small stove heated the stones. At night, when the fire was banked low, the stones radiated that heat back into the room, keeping the temperature even. The third layer was the insulation envelope. This was Vane's genius, the 18-inch double-wall gap packed with dry grass. The settlers saw trash. Vane saw millions of tiny, trapped air pockets, the single greatest insulator on Earth. It was dry, it was light, and it cost him nothing but time. The fourth layer was the thermal cap. The 3-foot-thick sod and earth roof was more than insulation. It was a windproof, massive barrier that, like the stone walls, soaked up heat and released it slowly. The fifth and final layer was the heat source. Culpeper had a fireplace, a hole that vented heat. Vane had an airtight stove. He controlled the airflow into the stove, burning his fuel slowly and completely. The stovepipe was not routed straight up. It ran 8 feet horizontally through a trough of clay and rock. Before exiting, a Petchka hybrid, ensuring that 80% of the heat from the exhaust smoke was captured by the cabin's thermal mass before it was lost. It was a closed loop, an ecosystem for warmth. In the second week of January, the Great White Ruin descended. It was a 3-day blizzard, a Rocky Mountain cyclone that piled snow 8 feet deep in the valley. Then the sky cleared and the temperature dropped. Dr. Arbuthnot's thermometer, kept in a sheltered box outside his tent, registered 38 degrees, 39 degrees, with winds that he calculated at a wind chill of below 80 degrees. This was the test. At 3:15 a.m. on the second night, the conventional wisdom collapsed. Literally, the green wood support beams in Culpeper's bunkhouse, already under strain, became brittle as glass in the extreme cold. The massive stone chimney, its mortar frozen, had cracked and shifted. The roof, designed to shed snow, had collected a 6-foot drift, which the 70-mile wind pushed against its weakest point. A sound like a cannon shot, the main beam, was followed by a grinding, tearing groan. The entire northern half of the roof collapsed, burying 6 men in snow, splintered wood and frozen rubble. The fortress had failed. In Vane's cabin, he was also buried. His entire home was under 10 feet of snow. This, however, was part of his design. That 10-foot blanket of snow was the final, perfect insulator. The 38-degree AFA air was now irrelevant. The temperature at his sod roof was a mild 30-degree APA. Inside, Vane stoked his small stove. His thermometer read 65-degree APA. He was calm, safe, and warm. The survivors of the bunkhouse collapse were in a desperate state. 2 men had broken legs. Another, Hiram Culpeper himself, had severe frostbite on his hands and face. They were in a panic, freezing, their shelter and all their supplies gone. For hours they floundered, until one man spotted the only sign of life in the frozen wasteland. The thin, metal stovepipe of Vane's hut, sticking just 2 feet above the 10-foot drift, a faint trail of heat haze rising from it. They clawed their way down the snow-walled corridor Vane had dug for his entrance and pounded on the door. Vane, startled, let them in. One by one, 6 hypothermic, terrified men stumbled into his 10-by-12-foot space. The tiny cabin, the hermit's hovel, now had to support 7 men. The challenge immediately shifted from heat to air. 7 men breathing in an 840 cubic foot, semi-airtight box. This is where Vane's operational discipline took over. He was no longer just a builder, he was a systems manager. "No wet clothes," he ordered. "Leave boots and coats in the tunnel. Breathe shallow." He took control of the stove, adding 1 small log every 90 minutes. But his most crucial act was managing ventilation. He had a tiny 4-inch fresh air pipe near the stove. Every hour he would briefly open it, along with a small exhaust port on the far wall. The temperature would drop 10 degrees, and the men would curse him. But Vane knew. "This isn't for warmth," he told them. "This is for life. We breathe out water, and we breathe out poison. If the walls get wet, we freeze. If the air gets bad, we sleep. And if we sleep, we die." For 2 days, 7 men lived in that 120-square-foot space, maintained at 55 degrees, surviving on Vane's knowledge. When the temperature rose to a mild degree, Dr. Arbuthnot, who had joined the men in Vane's hut, began his accounting. The Great White Ruin had been a catastrophic audit. The toll in Centennial City, 9 men dead from exposure. 14, including Culpeper, with severe frostbite requiring amputation. The company bunkhouse, a total loss, $150 in hardware and glass buried under the snow. The new brute force cabins had all failed, their occupants forced to huddle in the half-finished mine shaft. Then, the statistics from Vane's cabin. Cost, 8 zilzurs. Fuel consumed during the 3-day crisis, approximately 1/8 of a cord. Men sheltered, 7. Lives lost, 0. Injuries, 0. The data was undeniable. Culpeper, his hands bandaged, his face blackened by frost, sat before Vane in the tiny, warm room. Why, was all he could ask. Why did mine fall? Vane looked at the man who had mocked him. "Your house," Vane said, "was built to fight the wind. The wind is stronger. Your house was built to hold the snow. The snow is heavier. My house is built to join the mountain. The wind goes over it. The snow becomes its blanket." The lesson was learned. The mining company, facing financial ruin, hired Vane at a rate of $5 zeros a day to supervise all new construction. The spring of 1884 revealed a changed landscape. The half-built, proud log cabins were salvaged, their logs recut. The new settlement, built under Vane's direction, looked entirely different. The new bunkhouses were long, low-slung structures built into the south-facing slopes. They were all built on Vane's double-wall principle, using scrap lumber and packed grass insulation. The massive stone fireplaces were gone, replaced by small, efficient stoves imported at great expense. The look of the frontier, at least in this valley, had been forced to adapt. Dr. Arbuthnot published a paper in the Denver Medical Society Journal titled On the Prevention of Lung Fever and Frostbite Through Subterranean and Insulated Dwellings, which cited Vane's design as a medical necessity. The settlers had arrived believing that civilization was measured in square feet and the height of a roof. They learned through tragedy that survival in the extremes is measured in something else entirely. It is not about mass, but about intelligence. It is not about the force of the fire you build, but the physics of the envelope you build to contain it. The mountain does not care about ambition or aesthetics. It only respects the laws of thermodynamics. Silas Vane had never set out to be an engineer, but his tiny cabin became the blueprint for survival, a testament to the fact that the most powerful innovations are often born not of brute force, but of humble observation.